For the first question, the two methods used to measure brain activity are EEG and EEG and fMRI, or electroencephalography, measures the electrical activity of the brain through electrodes placed on the scalp. One strength of EEG is that it is very high temporal resolution, meaning that it can basically detect the brain activity changes very quickly in basically a millisecond. However, a limitation is that it does not show the exact location of the brain activity very accurately. So an fMRI, or a functional magnet imaging, measures changes in the blood oxygen levels in the brain, which helps identify which brain areas are active during a task. A strength of fMRI is that it is high spatial resolution, so it can show spatial brain regions involved in movement or learning. A limitation is that it is slower than EEG because blood flow changes takes more time than electrical signals. When comparing the two, EEG is better for studying the timing of brain activity, while fMRI is better for identifying where activity occurs in the brain. For studying motor learning, I think EEG would be more useful because motor learning involves fast changes in the brain activity during movement and practice. Since EEG captures activity almost immediately, it helps researchers understand how the brain responds. For question 2, basically, like one real life movement. Question 2, one real life movement example that fits Dental's two-dimensional taxonomy and skateboarding through a crowded parking lot. The skill involves basically both body transport and stability, regulatory conditions, and interior variability. Body transport meaning that the body moves from one location to another. In this example, the skateboarder is constantly moving across the parking lot. Stability refers to maintaining balance and posture during movement, especially while riding over cracks, turns, and slowing down. Regulatory conditions are environmental features that affect movement, basically, and requires the performer to adjust their actions. In this case, parked cars, moving people, curbs, uneven pavements, all influence how the skateboarder moves, basically. The skateboarder must constantly react to these environmental conditions. And interior variability basically means that the conditions change from one performance attempt to another. Every time the skateboarder rides through the parking lot, the environment is different. Cars may move, people may move, walk in different directions, or obstacles may appear in new locations. Because the environment changes each time, the movement skill requires constant adaptation and basically decision making. So for question 3, when the basal ganglia degenerate, motor performance becomes slower and less controlled. One major motor deficit is bradykinesia, which means like slow movement. People may also experience tremors, muscle rigidity, sorry about that, having a hard time speaking, and difficulty starting voluntary movement. Another issue is postural instability, which affects balance and coordination. These deficits occur because the basal ganglia plays an important role in initiating movement, controlling muscle activity, and smoothing out motions. The basal ganglia help the brain decide which movement should occur and which is basically like unnecessary movements that should be inhibited, basically. When degeneration degeneration happens. Like in Parkinson's disease, dopamine levels decrease and the communication within the motor system becomes disrupted. As a result, movement becomes slower, stiff, and like basically less coordinated. The person may know what movement they want to perform, but the brain struggles to basically send the efficient motor commands to the muscle, which is why movement often appears basically delayed or difficult to control. For question 4, so basically according to the dynamic systems theory, a control parameter is a factor that causes movement and like behavioral changes, while an order parameter is the overall movement pattern that emerges from like those changes. One real life example is basically when someone is hiking up a steep mountain trail. Like in this situation, fatigue levels act as the control parameter. As the person becomes more tired, the movement pattern changes to begins to change. At first, the hiker may walk with long, steady strides, but as fatigue basically takes over and increases, the person may naturally switch to shorter steps and slower movements. The walking pattern itself is the order parameter because it represents the organized movement behavior. This example shows how like increased fatigue, which is the control parameter, leads to qualitative change in movement patterns, or the order parameter. The body self-organizes into a new movement strategy to continue performing the tasks basically more efficiently. For question 5, so the central vision and the peripheral vision differs in the type of information they detect and how they help motor performance. Central vision focuses on object directly in front of us and provides detailed information such as shapes, color, and fine details. Peripheral vision detects motion and information outside of that direct line of sight. Central vision mainly uses cone photosynthetors, which work best in bright lights and helps with sharp visual details. Peripheral vision mainly uses rod photoreceptors, that's the word, yes, which are better at detecting movement and work well in lower light conditions. These photoreceptors contribute to functional differences because cones allow us to focus on precise targets, while rods help us detect movement and change in the environment around us. One real life example is driving a car on the freeway. Central vision helps the driver directly focus on the road, signs in the car directly ahead, and at the same time peripheral vision helps us detect nearby cars, changing lanes, pedestrians, or sudden movements from the side. Both types of visions work together basically to support safe and effective motor performance during driving. Question 6, vigilance is the ability to maintain attention and stay alert for a long period of time, especially when waiting for an important signal or event to happen. Vigilance affects reaction time because sustained attention usually decreases over time, especially during repetitive and mentally tiring tasks. As attention drops, reaction becomes slower because the brain takes longer to detect these response or to respond to important information. This decrease in attention over time is basically often called the vigilance discernment. Yes, when someone loses focus or becomes mentally fatigued, they may basically miss the signals or react more slower than they would at the beginning of the task. One real life example is a security guard monitoring surveillance cameras during a long overnight shift. At the start of the shift, the guard may react quickly suspicious movements or unusual activity. However, after watching screens or several hours, the little stimulation, vigilance may decrease, and reaction time may become slower. This could cause the guard response to the emergency or security threat to be slow. Question 7. One strategy that enhances memory and motor learning is chunking. Chunking basically means organizing smaller pieces of information into large groups that are easier to remember. This improves memory because the brain can process groups information more effectively. Instead of remembering many separate details, a real life example is learning a dance routine. Instead of like memorizing every single movement separately, the performer group movements into like small short sections or combinations. This makes the routine easier to learn and remember during performance. Another strategy is using meaningful cues or associations. This means connecting a movement skill to words, image, or experiences that already make sense to the learner. This improves like meaningfulness because information connected to prior knowledge is easier to store and retrieve from memories. A real life example is teaching a child how to shoot a basketball by saying reach into the cookie jar. During that follow through, the visual image helps the learner remember and connect the arm movement to more easier than like basically like technical instructions alone for a child. For question 8, both fixed and flexible central resources theory explains how attention is limited during performance, especially when people perform multiple tasks at the same time. However, this differs in how attention resources are distributed. The fixed central resource theory states that people have a limited amount of attention capacity that cannot change. According to this theory, if two tasks together require more attention than the person has available, performance on one or both tasks will decrease. Attention is viewed like a fixed pool of attention resources. The flexible central resource theory also believes attention capacity is limited, but it suggests people can adjust or allocate resources depending on task difficulty, motivation, or practice. Attention is more adaptable and can be distributed differently based on the specific situation. For example, someone jogging while listening to a podcast may perform both tasks successfully, but running has become like automatic, so you don't have to think about it. The flexible theory would suggest attention resources adjust efficiently, while the fixed theory would still argue both tasks completely for a limited amount of attention. Okay, question 9. In motor behavior, performance basically refers to temporary changes in movement behavior during practice. So basically, while learning refers to relatively permanent changes in skill capacity, the results from practice or experience. A person may perform well during practice, but that does not always mean true learning has occurred. Two performance characteristics that usually indicate learning are improvement, consistency, and persistence over time. The first characteristic is consistency of performance. This means that the performer can repeatedly complete the skill successfully, but with fewer errors and more stable movements patterns. For example, someone learning to parallel park a car may initially perform inconsistency, but after practicing, they begin parking smoothly and accurately almost every attempt. The second characteristic is retention, which means that the skill can still be performed well after a period without practice. For example, if someone learns how to ride a skateboard and can still perform basic tricks several weeks later without practice, this shows the learning has occurred because the skill was retained basically over time. Okay, and for the last question, number 10, contextual interference refers to the amount of interference or difficulty created when practicing multiple skills or variations of skills within the same practice session. The contextual interference effects refers to the finding that that high level of interference during practice basically may reduce the practice performance at first, but improve long-term learning and retention. One reason researchers believe contextual interference benefits learning is the elaboration hypothesis. This idea suggests that performing different skills basically in a random order forces the learner to compare and contrast movement patterns in working memory, creating stronger memory representations. Another explanation in the action plan reconstruction hypothesis is basically this theory states that when different skills are performed randomly, the learner must repeatedly rebuild or reconstruct the motor plan for each movement. This repeatedly reconstructs strengthening learning and improves retrieval like later. One practice activity with high contextual interference would be a volleyball player practicing serves. I am a volleyball player. Practicing serves, sets, spikes in a random order instead of repeating one skill at a time. For example, like the coach may call out a different skill before each repetition. This qualifies as a high contextual interference because performers constantly switch between movement patterns and must repeatedly adjust to the motor plans rather than basically repeating the same skill continuously. Thank you for listening.